Hello and welcome to APAC Games Weekly, episode 57. I am Connell Suter, and on APAC Games Weekly we take you through the biggest games headlines from the past week from across APAC. Today we've got a litany of stories including microtransaction sales dropping again in Japan, Southeast Asian games driving social change, questions around Southeast Asia's first homegrown AAA title, and ending on a story about a Japanese police officer playing Switch on shift, a classic fun Japanese tale. But let's kick off with a quick look at Japan's microtransaction sales in 2023. Microtransaction revenue in Japan drops for third consecutive year. A new report by the Nikkei has shown that microtransaction sales, particularly mobile gaming, in Japan have continued their downward trend for the third year in a row. Interestingly, the report shows that revenue from these sales is at 80% of what it was in 2019. The thing that's fascinating for me there is that it wasn't 2020. While most of the world boosted mobile gaming to insane levels during COVID lockdowns, Japan's gamers actually reduced their investment in mobile games. Throughout all the lockdowns of 2020 to 2022, their revenues never recovered to 2019 levels. The report has some thoughts on this but doesn't kind of fully explain why this is the case, but it does partially make you wonder about Japan's huge love of the Switch, which obviously fulfills the benefit of handheld gaming that mobile offers, while also providing more robust and expansive games. There's also, of course, the Nintendo effect there, which will hugely draw people to the Switch forever. The other things the report does suggest is that mobile games have begun to suffer the difficulties of PC and console games, where games are growing in scope and quality, massively increasing the development time and leading to less events and less time being spent on uncritical areas of the game, just to keep things going for players, instead focusing those attentions on games that are still to come out. On top of that, one of the things that the report does note is that many of the games that are continually doing well are absolute powerhouses, like Genshin Impact, which are unlikely to really see huge drops in quality until the game does, so that doesn't seem likely anytime soon. The other question posed here is if Japanese gamers prefer to buy full titles on mobile, which some data in the past has corroborated. It's a particularly interesting story to read this week, and while it is focused on mobile gaming, there's obviously been quite a lot of sort of semi-controversy, you could call it, about the level of microtransactions in Dragon's Dogma 2, which is a Japanese developed and published game all by Capcom. People have really called out some, what they at least say, I've not played it, but some egregious microtransactions, and it's interesting how it doesn't really match with this. It almost sounds like it's something to appeal to other gamers, and they're not focused at all on selling these to gamers in Japan. A very interesting one to compare. Southeast Asia is using the medium of games to drive social impact. As we all know, games are an incredible medium for delivering a message. Because of their interactivity, players can really feel connected to it in a way that perhaps films or television can't always do. Often that message becomes relevant to the game's world and characters, but utilizing this benefit for real-world issues is having benefits in Southeast Asia. Coral Island is a game by Stairway Games, which is a farming sim set on an island where players regularly will find trash washed up on the beaches. They then have the ability to recycle that into actually different useful materials throughout the game and at different stages. Many are holding this up as a great example of games showing real-world problems, but it isn't just Stairway Games and Coral Island. El Lim, who is founder and head developer of Indonesian studio Kalayan Arts, was asked about how games are dealing with environmental awareness in Indonesia, and went on to say, quote, "A recent study that found 70 to 80% of the total population are aware of environmental issues, however, only about 2% really understand the severity and how to actively tackle actions," unquote. He then went on to say, quote, "We collaborate with local NGOs all year round in various creative campaigns or organising cleanups. We are actively part of an environmentalist collective that holds a growing anti-plastic pollution movement every year in July." Unquote. Kalean Arts is a game studio that focuses actually on creating eco-friendly, positive messages in their games through their unique brand of storytelling. They've had some popular games in the past like Sumatra, which won quite a few awards and focused on an underwater journey and using that to talk about pollution around Indonesia's shores, where apparently 64 million tons of garbage enter the surrounding ocean every year, which is crazy. Their involvement with these environmentalist collectives has actually helped bring in plastic bag bans in Indonesia, which Elkem said he's very proud of. No doubt, it's a really, really cool thing to do and a great example of a game helping to progress a movement. Really, really cool. The studio's next game is actually called I Need Space and imagines a universe affected by a pandemic, much like COVID, but the gameplay focuses on climate change, with the player revitalizing planets you find, which is very similar to an old McMullen game, the guy that made Super Meat Boy and stuff. They had a game very similar to that, but not much of a climate change focus, more of a kind of mental health focus, but an interesting comparison to draw. It's also worth looking to other parts of Southeast Asia with this discussion, as it's not just Indonesia. In other parts of APAC, there was the Waisili Game Changers event, which took place last year and focused on driving real change through games. One of the winners of that was a Cambodian Vietnamese team, and that focused on plastic waste affecting marine animals and the environment. And there was even another game called Voice from the Forest, which is a Laotian Thai team who made this survival horror game about deforestation. A really, really interesting topic. I think it's a fascinating thing to make a game about. Overall, for me at least, it's just great to hear about games being made with a real world purpose. And that isn't to say that all games need to do this, or that they need to focus on it as the point of the game to have that impact. A great example, in my opinion, from Scotland is a game called Out and About, who I interviewed last year on my podcast Indie Views, and that game's a really cool game about permaculture, gardening, sustainability, foraging. It's a game that not only has a message but literally teaches you how to forage in real life, and you'll be able to take these in-game items that help you forage and get real life versions of them to do it. Really, really cool stuff, but it's all an interesting discussion about how games can change the real world and how they can deliver a message, and it's something that I think more games should still be talking about, because I know they're entertainment, but entertainment doesn't need to not be educational to some extent. Anyway, an interesting subject to discuss. What will it take for Southeast Asia to produce its first AAA video game? So this story is more of a discussion than of a singular event report. But it is a really fascinating topic about why has Southeast Asia never produced a proper AAA title in the past. Now I say in the past as obviously we had Skull and Bones this year, but that was made by a French headquartered company, of course, in Ubisoft. And it was based on a Western game from 10 years ago, obviously Assassin's Creed Black Flag, and it focuses on a quite European version of piracy that we're quite used to from all the pirate fiction that we have. What we haven't had though is AAA titles truly homegrown in Southeast Asia. Rappler spoke to Mufizal Mokhtar, who's general manager at Virtuos and has been art director of titles including Assassin's Creed Odyssey, about this topic. Before we go into the things he said, I think Virtuos are a really, really good example of a company to be involved in this discussion, as they've worked on some absolutely massive titles. There's a really fascinating behind the scenes sort of short documentary from a few years ago now about how they made basically all of the creature designs for Horizon Zero Dawn, which obviously are those incredibly intricate designs with panels that can be blasted off by the player and things like this. So to think that they've been working on such incredibly impressive assets for games that make the game in many ways, but we've never had a AAA game from them or studios like them. It's really interesting. So on this topic, Mufizal went on to say, quote, "The plan is, number one, to make people understand that this is a serious industry. We've got Indonesia, who's a powerhouse in art and animation. We've got the Philippines, also a powerhouse in art and animation. We've got Vietnam, we've got Kuala Lumpur, we've got Singapore, Japan. We've got a lot of talents over here. We need to figure out how to come together and create something that is resounding in the industry. There are more players playing, there are more developers developing, and there are more people tackling bigger and more expansive games. So the growth potential is definitely there, but there are some challenges that we still need to look at. For example, understanding cultural differences between Western and Eastern developers. Unquote. Now, there's so much in there that's interesting to talk about. I think there's a huge discussion to be had around AAA and then the differences between Western and Eastern developers. There's obviously huge cultural differences between AAA games made in Japan and those made in Western countries. They really feel like totally different approaches to game design. And then you have to ask, what does that look like if you have Southeast Asia making AAA games as well, somewhere in the middle? But to talk more about specifically things in his quotes, one of the things that I found very interesting about his comments is that he includes Japan, but doesn't include South Korea and China. Now, this isn't to say that he specifically left them out on purpose, but I think it's interesting to note because doesn't Japan kind of break this argument if you're including it as part of Southeast Asia? Now, obviously, Southeast Asia sometimes means only the kind of mainland part, extending down into Indonesia and places like this, but often it does include every country in Southeast Asia. Now, some say Japan and South Korea, I guess, would be Northeast Asia, which is totally fair enough, but he obviously includes Japan in this, so it's a bit of a strange one. Japan makes a million AAA titles. We're just talking about Dragon's Dogma earlier in the episode, but that hasn't really converted to the rest of Southeast Asia. I just found it interesting that he didn't focus on that aspect and then questioning why, when we're talking about understanding cultural differences between Western and Eastern developers, did he not mention the biggest powerhouse of AAA development in the East? In that way. Very, very strange. However, this likely is going to change. We did report on some stories last year and then I think even earlier this year about Japanese companies expanding into the rest of Southeast Asia. Of course, Capcom did this hugely with Street Fighter and really trying to bring people on board. What does that look like? Perhaps a Southeast Asia games network of all these countries working on more traditional, larger titles, perhaps with Japanese leading from the experience, perhaps just with Japanese companies involved. You know, it's a really interesting future in that way. Muzafiel went on to end the interview by saying, quote, "For the far future, I would love to see big studios emerging from Southeast Asia, multiple big studios emerging from Southeast Asia. But before we get that, I believe we need one success story to inspire everybody else to say that it's not impossible to do it. Let's do this." End quote. Watch this space, I think, is the larger message of what he's saying, but I find it really fascinating to think about what is the knock-on effect of Skull and Bones in this discussion. Of course, it didn't do particularly well and doesn't really show many signs of recovery. I think the games industry is particularly fickle now in terms of a bad release can really just ruin the entire reputation of the game. But of course, it's interesting to combine this with the changing demographics of Southeast Asia, with many countries moving from completely mobile gaming to actually more of a hybrid between console PC and mobile as well. Certainly, as we see this rise in mobile gaming, we are likely to see larger titles being made for those gamers. Interesting. And for our final quick story, Japanese police officer reprimanded for playing Switch games while on duty. So to finish the episode, we're going to focus on Japan loving Switch as usual. A police officer in Tenri has been caught playing Switch at work and on duty. He was actually caught with it hooked up to the TV in the break room when an unexpected inspection took place. The officer is in his 40s, so before anyone starts thinking this is some teenager or 20-year-old, and between November 2023 and February 2024, he played 17 hours of Switch, which, to be honest, isn't actually as bad as you might initially think. He also said that he only played it when there was very little to do and there's very little reports coming in. to the station. He immediately confessed and was scolded by the department, who will be taking the hours from his salary. You know, for me, when I read this story, obviously it's a fun little story, but I thought it was kind of oddly enjoyable to hear a story about police controversy that's so mild compared to what we often see in more local markets in the West. But, you know, this is it. Don't play Switch at work, and if you do it smarter. Come on. And that was it for APAC Games Weekly episode 57. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you back next week for episode 58. Remember though, don't play games at work, and if you do, best to make sure you're in Japan where they might understand and you only lose some hours of pay instead of being fired like I imagine most of the world would. Join us again next week at the usual time, Monday, 12 PM GMT, YouTube and Spotify. You know where to find us. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful week in the meantime.